You might be asking why we're talking about human origins and music, language, voice, history, politics, but mostly human origins. Well, if you know anything about genetic history, or genetics, human genetics right now, you will know that the theories of the Human Genome Project are that we all come from Africa. We all come from East Africa. And okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so then the question we ask as music people is, well, what does that say about the origins of language and the origins of music? And I'm going to make some, so I'm going to theorize this a little bit based mostly on scientific evidence. And I have the same skepticism that Karen does, or the sort of caution over the use of science without thinking about what its historical context and political context is. But anyway, I just want to say that when we talk about the deep history, we don't have early recordings or any kind of way of knowing what that music was. But so we're going to piece it together is what we will do. Okay, so the next thing, let me just see how I get this down here. There we go. Okay, so the first question is, what do you think the size of Africa is? And many of us, I think Africa is much smaller than it is, but here is the African continent, and it includes the United States, China, India, Eastern Europe, Italy, Germany, France. You can see a whole lot of countries fit into the sort of larger size of Africa. So I want you to just open up your sense of the capacity of what Africa might teach you, what you might have to learn about Africa. And I will just say the India thing is particularly interesting to me. I did some consulting for Disney about 10 years ago. And while I was at one of their places in Glendale, there was a proposal for a new theme park, and they had put India as bigger than Africa. And so Disney is very, very careful about scale. And so I asked them how they could do such a thing. And so what I'm saying to you is I think these are the stereotypes we have of the African continent that we're going to dispel in many kinds of ways. When we talk about the African continent, we're going to look at all 5 regions. In the past, when people have taught Africa, they've taught only sub-Saharan Africa. We haven't seen North Africa and the Sahara as part of the African continent. That's not the case here. We do the whole. You can see the 5 regions: Southern, Central, West, East, and North Africa. We deal with the Sahel separately. That's the sort of region underneath the Sahara Desert. We deal with islands, and we deal with the diaspora. And it's not just the diaspora to North America, but there's a very interesting musical connection between Angola and Brazil, for example. There's a very interesting story about the Swahili coast and the movement of Africans to India, and still speaking Hindi, but doing some really interesting cultural stuff that harkens back to the past. 3, in dealing with the sort of history of DNA in the world and where we come from, we are going to think about indigenous Africa, and this is a map that sort of maps out some of the people who've been there for a very, very long time. The San, the Hadza, the Baka are the, quote, who we know as, quote, pygmies. These are our indigenous communities that have been around for literally thousands of years. We do 4 of those groups in this class. And then we have to think about the historical past, and this might for us seem like Africa doesn't have a history. Here's a wonderful map of pre-colonial African kingdoms and empires. We will talk a little bit about these as we deal with each region. There's very interesting public broadcasting documentary film that deals with this very deep history. We can't do it all, but I will refer you out. So if you're interested in looking at it, I'm going to give you the materials for that. You can't talk about Africa without talking about colonization and the partition of Africa by European powers at the end of the 19th century. It's one of the most horrifying. You just can't imagine that Europeans can come onto a continent and literally take over in this way. So this is the partition into European constituencies, not caring about boundaries, not caring about language or culture, nothing, right? And then a few years later, in the mid-20th century, we have the decolonizing of Africa and the formation of nation states, with just 2 of them still sort of uncertain, Somaliland and the Western Sahara. This gives you some sense of the topography. So what is the landscape? We have 2 large desert areas, rainforest regions, savanna, all kinds of things. And this also gives you some sense of all the ocean, all the islands around the Indian and Atlantic Oceans mostly. But what I also want you to take a look at is way up here in Morocco. Look at the very almost no gap between the southern part of Europe and the northern part of Africa. There's a wonderful history to be told about there. We can't go into everything, but I'm going to point you to, and there are documentary films, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, there's a lot of publicly accessible material that you could explore if that's an area that you want to go into. So I'm going to point you to things. We won't necessarily cover it all, but by the end you'll have a very rich sense of the deep history and the contemporary in Africa. It's not just going to be about AIDS and war. I love this map. So this was a map created at Harvard, basically showing the ethnic diversity of Africa. So if we ever thought Africa is the most, with the DNA proves that it is the most diverse grouping of people in the world on the African continent, not what we thought probably. But this just gives you some sense of that diversity, and that means it's going to be hard to govern, right? Because you have so much language, so much culture, so much difference between people, and the differences are real. And so there we have the partition basically of large linguistic groups, if you're interested, so that you've got some kind of visual image of it. And then here is the DNA, the story of DNA of human migration. It begins in East Africa, where it says Masai and Luhia here. This is where we all come from, is what the DNA is suggesting to us now. And there is this migration out and around the world. There are many, many maps that you can look at. This was the easiest one that I could get to do it, but this is from about 200,000 years ago. This migration started to happen. Yeah, just really interesting stuff. So the DNA, Spencer Wells is the kind of popular evolutionary anthropologist who has done stuff. If you get on YouTube, you'll find a lot of the journey of man. Yes, it is man. Tracing the single origin of humankind, the movement. So what we will look at in the beginning and through each region is the archaeological evidence of material culture. We'll look a little bit at oral narratives. Some of it is very deep, so we can trace back to 13th century Malian epic narrative that continues on. Then we have, of course, some of the evidence we have is the rock art, both in North Africa and in southern, actually all over Africa. We have the Egyptian frescoes, okay, just to give, and then of course Penn has some of these Benin plaques, not so many musical, but, and everything is controversial because how do institutions and museums get these things and keep them? So this just gives you some brief sort of overview of what Africa is, 1.2 billion people, where the largest places are, what deserts we have. Islam and Christianity are the two most popular religions, but of course there's a lot of indigenous religion too. We've talked about all of this stuff. So the most important thing I think as I draw this together is to say to you, Africa is about rhythm, but it is about so much more. It is about drumming ensembles, but it is about so much more than that. The voice is the primary instrument in Southern Africa, and the voice does extraordinary things. And of course, voice comes to matter for political voice, for emotional voice, for representation. It comes to matter in so many different kinds of ways. Instruments are distributed across the continent, and sometimes we've tried to create the sort of lineage of one instrument as it appears in different parts, but sometimes there are discontinuities. So here's just an image of some of the traditional instruments. It's not just drumming, as you can see, and when it is, it's many different kinds of drumming. The other part of this, a big part of, well, a good part of what we think about in this class will be diaspora, because that's what connects us in the United States back to Africa, is through the journey, the very traumatic slave trade to the United States. But there has been a lot of conversation that's happened back from particularly African-American popular music back to Africa via Cuba sometimes. So there's an amazing kind of story of the movement back and forth of musical styles that get indigenized and given local histories. There's a lot of really interesting stuff to do, and you can take it in that direction if you want to. We'll do keywords just to help you you know, we'll do it for the study of Africa, we'll do it for the study of African music. These are the things I'll give you in each class so that you develop a language for talking about the sounds that you're hearing. It's not complicated. It's there just to help you to know how to listen and how to hear and to interpret what you're having. So in summary, we're going to do the five African regions with islands and the diaspora and the Sahel, actually. We will look at the deep history through 3 hunter-gatherer communities. These communities have almost been wiped out in the 20th century after being around literally for hundreds of thousands of years. We have successfully almost destroyed them, but we do have recordings from the 20th century that we can listen to. The way I've taught this in the past is that each person picks a place they want to examine a little bit more in depth, and they develop a playlist. But it's a scholarly playlist. So you do the research around the tracks that you're listening to in order to tell a bigger story. So it is based on your listening and what you are hearing and what you are understanding as you listen, and the stories that can be told around the music that you are hearing. We can do discussion forums. I've got all of this, you know, I've got all of this prepared already. We use afropop.org, which is an NEA and NEH funded amazing body of research, and there are podcasts and all kinds of things available there that we can have conversations around if we each listen to 54 minutes. It's filled with the sound of Africa too, so it's not just words. It's a lot of music making interspersed with the words. So very, very accessible, pleasurable ways to come to know about Africa. Yeah, and it will be science informed, because that's how we in many ways give Africa a deep sense of the past. Okay, I'm done. Thank you, everybody, and I'm happy to answer questions. My email is in the chat.